Hello, everyone. I'm Paris Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership with Tom Fox, hosted by Richard Lummis.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of 12 O'Clock High, podcast about leadership. This is Richard Lummis. I'm here with Tom Fox for another discussion on how to improve our leadership skills. We believe leadership is a skill which can be improved with study of both good and bad practices, and we try to draw interesting examples from many sources, including history, fiction, film, and business writing. Welcome back, Tom.
Thank you, Richard.
Today we're going to continue our series of podcasts discussing economic disasters, financial panics, and market bubbles. Quick reminder, the inspiration is one of the great course series of lectures, Crashes and Crisis Lessons from a History of Financial Disasters by Professor Connel Fullenkamp of Duke University. Today we're discussing one of the stranger bubbles, that of the Mississippi Company. The main player in the drama is a fascinating Scotsman named John Law. Son of a goldsmith and banker, he moved to London and became a gambler, got involved in a duel, killed the man, was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. Somehow the stories diverge on how he escaped to Europe. He continued to make a living gambling while learning more about financial markets and banking in Venice, Amsterdam, and Paris. He ultimately came to believe that paper, or fiat currency, was the key to economic growth. He's been called an early Keynesian, although it should be noted Keynes did not mention him as an inspiration. I think you'll see why as we get into this podcast. At the time, in the early 18th century, paper money was quite rare in Europe and was usually only used locally. The historical background is that the government of France was essentially bankrupt following the death of Louis XIV. Louis XV was only 5 years old, so a council of regents were appointed, which included a man whose title was the Duc d'Orléans. National debt in France was the equivalent of almost 200 million pounds compared to about 50 million pounds for England. Taxes were excessive. Some had already been paid 5 years in advance for the government to get funds up front. Farmers had abandoned their fields to avoid conscription for the various wars, and the economy was just a mess. So Law proposed, I guess he'd run into the Duc d'Orléans at gambling circles, but he proposed the creation of a national bank to issue paper money. The Duke couldn't get the entire Council of Regents to go along, but they did agree to allow a private bank, the Banque Générale, to form in 1716 as a joint stock company. The bank was allowed to issue paper notes, but it was banned from international trade and insurance. Initially, it operated quite conservatively. And then in April 1717, citizens were allowed to pay taxes using Banque Générale notes, which is sort of a backwards way of introducing paper currency. In August of 1717, it was formed into the Compagnie des Indes, which is known as the Mississippi Company by everybody. And it was granted a monopoly on trade with French properties in North America. They sold shares in exchange for short-term government debt, and then exchanged the short-term debt with the French government for longer-term debt at a lower interest rate. Continuing the theme of political intervention, in August of 1718, the government granted it a monopoly on tobacco and then trade to Africa. In early 1719, Law did something interesting. He posted a huge bond and essentially guaranteed that the stock price would double in 6 months. People took that as a sign of confidence on the part of an insider, and the stock started to rise. He's then allowed to take over the French East India Company and China Company and was granted a monopoly on trade with the Barbary States. Then, the company obtained the right to mint coins and collect taxes. At this point, it looks like a pretty good deal. In 1719, they issued new shares at 550 francs, but you only had to pay 75 francs down and pay the rest in monthly installments. Demand was so high, Law limited it to people who already owned 4 shares. Therefore, in order to get a share, you had to go buy some more on the open market, which of course drove the price up. He repeated the tactic in the summer, and the price reached 5,000 francs a share by October. At this point, Law issued 150,000 shares at a price of 5,000 francs, but it was on credit with 10% down. He loaned the money that he obtained to the government. In January of 1720, he was named Comptroller General of Finances. People started to try to realize their gains and redeem their stock, and Law tried to prop up the stock price by offering to redeem shares at the price of 9,000 francs. A lot of people wanted to take him up on the offer, and in order to keep up with redemptions, he had to merge the Royal Bank into the company and start printing a lot of money, forcing people to accept paper money instead of gold. Supply of money in France doubled between January and mid-May of 1720, causing enormous price inflation as well. Law still couldn't keep up with the redemptions, so he lowered the redemption price to 5,000 francs a share and limited redemption of the Royal Bank notes to 50% gold and 50% paper. This all caused confidence in the entire scheme to collapse, and so the share price collapsed along with it, and Law eventually was forced to flee the country and spent the rest of his life in exile in Venice. I know that's a complicated summary, but it's a complicated scheme, I guess. Tom, where would you like to begin today's discussion?
So let me just pick up on your last point, Richard, which is it was a complicated story. It was a complicated scheme, but for the time, it was an incredibly radical economic theory. And we live in a largely, well, I guess we would say post-paper economic system now with electronic trading. But for the largest part of our lives, we lived in a paper specie-based economy, but that specie was guaranteed by the word of the U.S. government, not by gold, not by land, not by something else. And that debt, if you look at a dollar bill, it says can be redeemed by the U.S. government or will be redeemed by the U.S. government for all debts due and owing, or I guess legal tender is the phrase. And what I think Law missed was the specie he envisioned was not really backed by anything. And so the speculation which occurred, they couldn't really keep the paper money tied to any specific thing of value or rational thing of value. The other thing was that many of his ideas have become de rigueur. Certainly the pumping money into the economy, I think John Maynard Keynes would have fully embraced that at some point in his career. And the really uniqueness of Law. We should mention that after he left England from his imprisonment for murder, he studied finance in Amsterdam, which is one of the cities we visited a little bit earlier in an earlier podcast. Was really found it was really one of the top cities for economic theory at the time. But also some of the themes we see in the Mississippi Company case are consistent with the themes from the South Sea Bubble and the Tulip Bubble, which is the having no skin in the game, being able to buy stock on loan and on terms that were incredibly favorable, with the added bonus that Law was actually loaning people the money to buy the stock.
Right.
So I've seen companies do that. They didn't exceed to the amount as a Mississippi Company, but when you start loaning money to people to buy a franchise, to buy a something, you begin to see problems involved. The other interesting thing was, I'm not sure, many of the readings say that Law unleashed forces which were beyond his control or that he didn't understand. I'm not sure I buy either one of those. Economic theory in 1720 may not have recognized these powers. In 2008, we may not have recognized economic forces that were the United States was facing at that time. So, but Law certainly unleashed economic forces that he couldn't control. And I really found the interesting part of what led to the pop of the bubble was the two intertwined events, which was the first that speculators who had bought on the original 500 franc subscription now held paper that was between 5 and 9,000 francs, and they wanted to cash in and by redeeming their stock. To do so, that's when Law had to prime the pump and dump paper money into the economy. And as you correctly noted, he dumped doubled the money supply in less than 6 months. Typically, that leads to runaway inflation, not hyperinflation, but certainly runaway inflation. That did not seem to be a part of or a feature of the Mississippi company case. Yet when you put that much paper money into an economy, you're going to significantly devalue pretty much everything.
Yeah. But I want to point out that Fullenkamp, of course, we've already hit on two of his points, which is government intervention and the easy credit. But he says the mistake that ended Law's career was when he reduced the redemption value from 9,000 francs to 5,000 francs a share, and did it by decree. And Fullenkamp says, well, he had to deflate it somehow, but doing it by decree was too much for the public to take, and so that's what turned the perception against him.
And I thought that was interesting as well because here we're trying to get away from the run of the maddening crowd mentality. Yet here, Fullenkamp, it seemed to me, with that point you just raised, returns to that.
Yeah.
That it was the perception by him reducing by fiat the price of the stock when he could have done it in some other way, which perhaps would have worked, perhaps not. Nevertheless, it was that reduction showed there was either not support or that the stock was going to be weakened and people wanted to get out while the getting was good.
Yeah. The other thing that struck me about this is here we have a company that was thought to have a viable trading business but didn't. One of the things that happened was they had initially believed that the Mississippi River Valley contained quantities of gold similar to that from that the Spanish were getting from Central and South America. Simply turned out not to be true. Some of the articles speculate that that's how Law planned on getting out of this mess, was by mining gold in the Mississippi region and bringing it back to France. But you'll also note that he had monopolies on trading with China and India and Africa, which would have included the slave trade. And all those should have had a great deal of value. The reasons they didn't pan out, I think, would require a really deep dive into the history of the 18th century and English competition with France, especially in India and the Far East. And it's not really clear to me at what point the insiders realized that they didn't have a business here, and that it was all a fraud, if they ever did.
The other interesting thing that you touched on in your opening on this podcast, if we could tie it back to the prior podcast on the South Sea Bubble, was the reason for the French national debt.
Yeah.
And it was, in this case, it was not war by England, but it was war against England. Also, it was fourfold higher. Louis XIV had bankrupted the country through a 75-year reign of spectacular over everything. But I've enjoyed the Palace of Versailles as much as the next person. But
we didn't pay taxes for it.
We didn't pay the taxes for it. We just enjoyed it. So you had a bankrupt country, and you saw a government struggling with ways to not only pay down the debt, pay the interest on the debt, but coming to the idea that they would once again monetize that debt. And they, a little bit different than the South Sea Bubble, but the same general, I think, concept to use that debt to tacitly indicate that debt was guaranteed without actually guaranteeing it.
Right. Well, and then, of course, Law thought that simply by printing money you could create viable economic activity, which turned out not necessarily to be true.
Well, Richard, this one was really interesting because I'm not sure John Law was really a bad actor. I think his ideas were proved unworkable and certainly led to financial hardship. But I didn't see him as a market manipulator and insider for the purposes of insider trading as we did with the South Sea Bubble. Do you have a different view on that?
No, I have about the same view. The interesting thing, of course, was some of the damage that it did to the French economy and the prestige of the royal family can possibly be blamed for part of the French Revolution. But I don't think Law had anything to do with that.
I would agree, but that's a great point. We may have to explore that at a further date because the French economy never really came out.
Yeah.
And then Louis XVI basically bankrupted the country again by supplying the Americans with goods, arms, and ships, allowing us to defeat the British in the Revolutionary War.
Well, that's not the way I was taught it in elementary school. Well, thank you for listening. This is Richard Lummis and Tom Fox with 12 O'Clock High. We hope you'll listen in next time when we discuss the Panic of 1907.
This is Paris Fox again. We hope you enjoyed this episode of 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership with Tom Fox. If you enjoyed the show, please go to iTunes and rate the podcast. Thank you for listening.